What do radical relationality and topography of gathering mean for people who feel fragmented today?
Hmm. Radical relationality, topography of gathering. Um, I think this generation. Well, there's a couple of things happening. I think the current generation, they are looking for a spiritual home, and one of the components is they're returning back to the old smelly boxes because there aren't uh, other options. So there's so many things that are happening right now. We have, let's say, progressive Christianity, which is really trying to introduce a deeply relational and conversive framework for this new generation. But there's some that say, well, Christianity is not it. And the same thing is happening in the religion of Islam, in Baha'i and Hinduism and Buddhism. There's a richness there. There's a richness in there. And some of them will find it in old patterns. Some of them are finding it in different ways, in new patterns. And I think that's where we find this idea of radical relationality happening. The modern systems just kind of don't work because it forces us to sort of have repetitive patterns and the same and the old ways. I'm reminded of colleague Dale Irvin in his book Traditions and Traditioning Rendering Accounts. And he was talking about the communion. And there was a battle between the mature congregation saying communion has to be the bread and the juice or the bread and the wine. It can't be no other way. But you had a younger generation that was still seeking that community and that spiritual engagement, but they had to use the tools that were around them. So they had soda and they had candy, or they had, chips. So they took what was around them and needed for sustenance of life in their day-to-day, and they made that sacred, right? They took that and creating healing spaces. This is what I call that radical relationality, where we see just the divine at work at those moments. And if we're saying no, it can only be old patterns, then there's a death there. There's no way to reconstruct. And I think when we're looking at what deconstruction has done and what meta-modernism is doing, we're saying no. There's many ways. There's actually a whole topography of ways of being or becoming, and a whole topography of how we gather. We can gather in online spaces. We can gather in face-to-face. We can gather in a roller skating rink. We can gather and have these certain types because we make sacred at that moment what needs to be sacred. It allows for pure difference to happen and still see the sacred at work. It does away with this idea of being fragmented, that in order for me to be accepted, I have to do it this old way. But this is not really who I am. And sort of like this radical relationality and this new idea of thinking about topography of gathering is saying, hey, how do you experience the divine in the most powerful way? And from there, what we do is we create the maps, the topography, the terrain of what does it mean to gather in that spiritual space, and who are the ones that walk with you, some closer, some farther, because that is a more honest, more authentic way of living.